Yes, I think perhaps not as high as some people had anticipated. I think some people, and including me, thought he might get something like 35 years, but maybe 30, 35 essentially doesn't make a great deal of difference at this stage. She said at one point, the judge, that she was giving him a 20% reduction for his guilty pleas, although she talked about his shame rather than his remorse. She didn't pull her punches. She said that he'd had a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and empowered to do so, even to the extent of being authorised to carry a gun. And that really was one of the main themes of her sentencing remarks, that he had abused his power as a police officer to entice, reassure or intimidate his victims. And I think that was always going to be the case, although police officers are often given compounded sentences where they commit crimes on duty. None of his crimes were committed on duty, but very clearly and obviously to the judge, he used his status as a police officer to help him commit those crimes. And we heard from a number of victims, didn't we, yesterday, who said that they were encouraged to meet him because he was a police officer, telling some of them that they would be safe with him because he was a police officer, and then threatening them with, in one case, a gun. Perhaps it was a replica gun, nobody can be sure, but showing his warrant card to others, and then to many of his victims telling them that because he was a police officer, if they ever did complain to the authorities about his attacks on them, their word would not be believed over his.
And Martin, we're expecting to hear from the police and also the Crown Prosecution Service.
Yes, we're going to hear, I think, immediately hear from the officers who finally investigated Carrick. Now, these are officers from the Hertfordshire Police Force who worked also with Bedfordshire and Cambridgeshire police forces, and those three were involved because the victims largely came from that part of the world. But we're probably going to hear from the senior officer involved in the investigation. I don't know that we're going to hear from the Metropolitan Police at this stage. They weren't involved directly in the investigation, and we did hear from them yesterday. Another in a long line of apologies from the Metropolitan Police for allowing Carrick to continue in his job, even when they did know that he had at least been accused of predatory behaviour over many years. So yes, we'll hear from the detective involved in this prosecution of Carrick, and we'll also hear from the Crown Prosecution Service, which of course played a big part in the formulating of the charges to which Carrick eventually was persuaded to plead guilty, persuaded by the wealth of evidence against him, the numbers of victims who had complained about him, and a very obvious pattern of behaviour over many years in which ultimately he was convinced that he couldn't argue, as he had originally on his arrest, that he either couldn't remember those crimes or those attacks, or he had only ever had sex with any of those women by their consent.
And Martin, what did you make of the tone of the sentencing? There was clear, I felt, sort of simmering anger, but behind a lot of what the judge was saying, where she talked about why some of the women had not come forward, how they felt that they wouldn't be believed. She said it spoke to the moral corruption of the way that victims are treated in society, and the fact that he had used his position was clearly an aggravating factor here.
Yeah, she talked about his malign influence. I didn't quite catch everything she said, but she talked about how that stood in the way of the revolution of women's dignity. So I'm sure we would have heard something similar from a male judge, but perhaps there's an added poignancy that we were hearing those words from a woman judge. I mean, she was very calm and collected in her delivery, as you would expect from a judge. But yes, I think perhaps we could read behind that she did have an awful lot of sympathy and empathy with those women, victims, from whom she had heard, if not directly, she'd heard their victim impact statements yesterday, when they went into dreadful detail about how they had lived in fear, they had suffered great physical pain, but also they'd been intimidated by Carrick into not reporting what he had done to them, and then subsequently had gone on to suffer in their own relationships. Their lives, their mental health had been damaged, and particularly one victim I spoke to yesterday, a fellow police officer of David Carrick, who said that she had lived ever since 2004, after he raped her, with her guilt for not reporting him at the time, but said, look, maybe I had a greater responsibility to report him. I was a police officer, but I'm also a human being.
And Martin, we can hear loud voices behind you. There are a lot of people who are very angry about this case, aren't there? And a lot of people down there protesting against violence against women.
You've got any live capability there? No.
Yes, this is a protest group that was here yesterday, been here today since about 9 o'clock, since before the hearing started. Essentially, making their voices heard about the whole issue of male violence, and holding this case up as a shining example of how men do go undetected when they are committing crimes against women. I mean, of course, many are caught and convicted, but they're holding up the case of David Carrick as somebody who was allowed to commit many offences, many terrible crimes against women, even though some of those offences were reported. There was a gathering of intelligence around this man, who was a police officer as well, a man, as the judge said, empowered to hold up the law. In spite of all that, he was allowed to continue for more than 20 years serving as a police officer.